Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. The commander we're discussing in this installment is really excited to make a clone copy of you, near Orvar, wherever you are. Orvar the All-Form, like our old pal Mistform Ultimus, is also a 4-mana blue 3/3 with all creature types, but also with a sickening ability. No, really. It's sickening. There are a lot of things Wizards of the Coast could have done to rein this guy in, but they instead let him off the hook completely. Whenever we cast a spell that targets at least one of our other permanents, Orvar lets us make a copy of that permanent. He also has a discard ability, but that's far less relevant in EDH. The selling point here is absolutely the ease with which he doubles up our stuff. While Mistform Ultimus decks still seek to take advantage of its many creature types, Orvar's page shows us that players are all in on the copy ability. Each of these 1-mana spells can create additional copies of our creatures, our mana rocks, and even our lands, utterly crushing our opponents with an unstoppable train of value. Let's get started by taking Orvar's average deck and importing it to the Archidekt deck building website. Remember that, as always in this series, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. So I'm gonna give you all a little peek behind the curtain here. We get tons of requests for videos about different commanders, ones that I'd be totally excited to talk about, but when I pull up the average list, there's like nothing I would tune up. The deck is almost exactly where I would want it to be, with maybe 1 or 2 swaps, but not enough to make a full video about. Orvar is kinda one of those. I think this average list is awesome. It's very well tuned. Orvar is a ramp machine. Tons of these little 1-mana spells can target any type of permanent, including his lands and mana rocks, drastically accelerating our mana production. Best practice is always to wait to play Orvar until we have enough mana to also copy something else, to make sure that the value starts rolling in ASAP. There are, of course, crazy good creatures to duplicate too, so a tiny 1-mana spell might make us a lot of copies of, say, a Master of Waves to overwhelm the board with increasingly huge tokens, or copies of Archmage Emeritus, each of which will draw us more cards as we continue to play more of our tiny spells. The most important cards in the deck, however, are the buyback spells. Whim of Volrath and Mind Games don't just target our stuff, they go back to our hand so that we can do it again. If we target a Peregrine Drake with one of these, we'll get our spell back and make a copy of the Drake, which will untap more lands than we needed to use to cast the spell in the first place, allowing us to float extra mana every time. By repeating this loop, we wind up with infinite mana, at which point we can cast the buyback spell again on every other permanent we control too, giving us infinite copies of all of our cards, including infinite lands and infinite creatures. If you also happen to have a Lightning Greaves, you can then make infinite copies of that too, to give the whole army haste. Even an innocent little mana rock like Mind Stone, copied infinite times with infinite mana, means we can play our whole deck on the spot. And Peregrine Drake isn't even the only thing that lets us go infinitely crazy like this. There are a ton of other combos packed into this deck, and a lot of them are unlocked by these crazy buyback interactions. These key spells are so important that tutors like Spellseeker and Solve the Equation are very keen in this average deck to help find the enablers that make Orvar masterfully lethal. Like I said before, I think this deck is already dang near perfect, so I'm not going to have the usual 3-section breakdown for this video. Instead, I just want to spend a little bit of time getting to know the cards that are already here and what makes them so dang good compared to the alternatives that we could be using. And once we understand those just a bit more, that's when we can finally make some of those teensy swaps that will spruce things up, just that extra amount to take us from good to great. And of course, don't forget to stick around to the end of the video for some honorable mentions if you want to find some ways to build Orvar a bit more budget friendly. Alright, let's get started. I'm just gonna geek out a little about the subtle and not so subtle things that help make this list so well tuned. Swarmyard can help us regenerate very specific types of creatures, and Orvar is all of those types. It's a land that helps us protect the commander. If we make multiple copies of a card like Cloudpost, they each tap for progressively more and more mana. Or what about these copyable creatures? If we have a Venser in play, every 1-mana instant is a pseudo counterspell or an outright bounce effect. We can pay 1 mana over and over and over again to boyoyoing enemy boards with Scourge of Fleets too. Or, if we're especially vicious, we can make more copies of Orvar with Spark Double and Sakashima. which means we can also start copying those versions of our commander with our 1-mana spells. 2 will lead to 4, 4 will lead to 8, 8 will lead to 16. This is an exponential multiplier, and if we've learned anything from Scoot Swarm, it's that this gets out of hand even after just like 3 or 4 iterations. We don't need to pack the deck with a ton of creatures because we really only ever need one of them in play for Orvar to relentlessly copy over and over. The world will be overrun with our simulacra. Then, of course, there's Archaeomancer and Shipwreck Dowser, which get back the spells we've already cast. This is another way of, quote, buybacking our spells, and they also allow us to create some crazy loops. For instance, whenever we target the Archaeomancer, Orvar will make a copy of it and return a spell from our graveyard to our hand. Then our first spell resolves, and we can use the spell we just got back to copy the Archaeomancer again, which brings back the first spell we cast. Before we know it, we're swimming in creatures. And can we just appreciate those artifacts too? Whim of Volrath makes us infinite copies of Gilded Lotus, since each Lotus enables us to cast the next one. Multiple copies of Sapphire Medallion means that our buyback spells only cost like 1 blue mana, so we can repeatedly target our islands. And every new island can tap to cast the buyback spell again. So yeah, we will have infinite islands. They'll be tapped, but that just means that our next turn is probably gonna be game winning. Or if we happen to have cast something like a High Tide before we start this loop, then we'll actually gain mana each time we create an island, giving us an infinite supply of not just our islands, but then subsequently all of our other cards as well. There's also Coveted Jewel. Copies of this thing refund our mana and draw us more cards. This card is risky in other decks, but here, it's an engine, because those 3 cards will probably include another 1-mana spell to make another copy of the jewel, and then another and another and another until we find exactly the lineup we need to make the battlefield explode with infinite reflections. So yeah, this deck is insane. But all this begs the question, which nuts and bolts need tightening? Are there any wheels that need a little grease? One of the first things I did when researching and playtesting this commander was go searching for any cheap blue spells that target our permanents, and it turns out there are a whole lot of them out there. My goal is to see if any of them are currently being underplayed for Orvar, but again, that field is really huge. And with that many options, how do we narrow it down to the best of the best? Are there any guidelines that we can follow? I think that there are. Here are a few rules that I found to help make sure that we're playing the very best spells for Orvar. First is, naturally, mana cost. The cheaper, the better. This probably goes without saying, but when we have so many 1-mana options, a 2 or 3 mana spell would have to be something truly special to be worth the extra cost. Second is recyclability. Whim of Volrath is an MVP card precisely because of its buyback, so that we can make multiple copies of things with just 1 spell. Buyback isn't the only way to achieve this, though. Trait Doctoring and Hidden Strings, for example, cipher onto a creature, so that we can cast them again if we hit someone with that creature. Not all spells can cast themselves multiple times, though, so in lieu of outright buyback effects, we can also look to use spells that can trip, drawing a card to replace or recycle themselves. This helps us chain through multiple spells per turn without running out of cards in our hand, and it digs us down to our most important key spells. Third is versatility, and this one is a huge deal. We really want to try and avoid cards that would only target one type of thing. We don't just want to make multiple Agents of Treachery, we want to make multiple Soul Rings, or hide behind 5 propagandas. When our spells can target any permanent, then at the very least, Orvar can always use it to just copy one of our lands, which is itself pretty incredible for 1 mana. The ability to target a versatile array of cards is really that important. Originally, I was looking real hard at a card like Defy Gravity to add to the deck, because the flashback means that it's 2 spells in 1. But since it only hits creatures, I think that vastly reduces its utility, to the point that I decided it doesn't make the cut, at least not compared to the other cantrips that help us dig down faster for our most important cards. Note that versatility also applies to speed, by the way. An instant has way more lines of play than a sorcery speed effect. Fourth is actually defense. Orvar draws a lot of attention to himself. If a card also doubles as a defensive option, like Giga Drowse, which can tap down potential attackers and copy something on our side, then that is definitely worth paying attention to. And finally, untap/blink. Spells that untap a permanent are clutch, because we can do things like copy our Gilded Lotus while untapping the one we already have. Blink spells are also powerful ingredients in Orvar's possible combos. Ghostly Flicker, for example, is 3 mana, but it can target any type of permanent and then it returns them immediately to the battlefield, which means it can protect our stuff from removal, untap our stuff, and also just go infinite with Archaeomancer and Peregrine Drake. Untap and blink effects reset our stuff while we're creating new stuff, which gives us better momentum. It's easy to see how a bunch of the spells that already appear in this list meet several of these conditions. Clock Spinning is a versatile and reusable spell. Thermal Flux is cheap, can target anything, and it replaces itself. Dream's Grip resets one of our cards, can target any type of permanent, and it works as a very small defensive tool. There are a few cards in this deck that do only target creatures, but since they replace themselves, they meet a very important criteria. So, even though there are a ton of other cards out there that could also totally work for Orvar, the ones we've already got here are hitting the quadrants that need hitting. This is why I'm ultimately as happy as I could be with the spells we've got here already. So then, what changes am I actually making? There are only a few, and they mostly concern the cards we plan to actually copy. My first cut here is Mind Flayer. It's a pretty cool card to get multiple copies of, but at the rate we can make those copies, I think this is probably the lowest card on the ladder. Cool effect, but it's answerable, and to be honest, I think there are better versions of this effect out there anyway. I'd like to replace it with another spell I think Orvar will like, and that's the card Hydroblast. Hydroblast counters spells and destroys permanents if they're red. Note, though, that it doesn't only target red cards. You can target anything with this, but it only destroys the target if it's red. I feel like this hits our criteria really well. It's cheap as can be, it can target any type of permanent, and it has a possible defensive application if we need it to. Next, let's look at this Murmuring Mystic. I almost like this one, but it's slowly wore me out. The rate of bird acquisition is cool when we're copying it, but it's just not as impactful as our other cards. Like, Docent of Perfection isn't in this average deck, which I think is a pretty big sign. Copying these creatures means that every spell spits out a lot of tokens, but this still takes a while to actually ramp up to a genuinely powerful or lethal board state, unlike the immediate impact of a card like Master of Waves, or the exponential power of the Spark Double synergy. We've also seen already that Orvar is constantly angling to make infinite copies of any creature, which renders the effect of a token maker kinda redundant. It's definitely nice to have a backup if we're not able to get to those infinite combos, but I don't think Murmuring Mystic holds up. It doesn't add anything new to that dynamic when compared to what we've already got and to what we could play instead. So, for replacements, I'm going to suggest a very cheap Transmute spell. There are tutors all over this deck. Spellseeker, the Wizard Cycling spell, Solve the Equation, Mystical Tutor. We've got key cards Orvar needs to find as soon as possible, and Dizzy Spell helps us find them too. Looking for that 1 mana buyback? Dizzy Spell has you covered. There's one final creature I'm cutting, and that's the card Torrential Gearhulk. I hemmed and hawed about this one for a while because it does bring back a spell with that ability. When we make a copy of this, we could in fact end up with many copies of this. I like that, but in truth, the fact that it exiles the spell it flashes back means that there is a cap on its power, and it's a cap that I think our enemies will be able to conquer. Don't worry though, the card I'm swapping in for the Gearhulk is another amazing 6-mana artifact, Caged Sun. This card's good in just about any monocolor deck, but here, it's a win condition. Why? Because we can make multiple copies of it. Duplicating a Caged Sun enough times means each of our islands taps for 4, 5, 6 mana. At that point, using a random clock spinning on an island gives us a new island that will tap for more mana than we spent to cast the buyback spell. This again allows us to create infinite mana and infinite copies of everything we control. Caged Sun isn't just a value piece, it's one of the scariest artifacts we could possibly play. I said that was the last creature I was cutting, and that's true, but I'm actually not done yet. I've just got one more swap to make, and believe it or not, it's right here in the mana base. I'm not big on Castle Vantress. I think it's only just fine, I guess. I could just cut an island here, but I kinda like keeping the island count as high as possible because of the Mystic Sanctuary, so I just think that if I'm gonna run a utility land, instead of the Vantress, I think that the land should really do something truly crazy, such as this here, Sun-Scorched Desert. It doesn't look like much, but if this is a deck that can make infinite copies of everything, why wait for combat? Infinite creatures need haste if they're gonna win via combat. But infinite deserts? Ping the board to death right on the spot. Watch out, blue's got burn. That's it for my official swaps, but real quick, here are some honorable mentions. If you're looking to make an Orvar deck that's a little friendlier on the budget, what will that look like? Well, first, I'm actually going to take us back to Orvar's EDH Rec page for a quick observation. Among all of these cards in the high synergy section, cards which over 50% of players are running in their decks, Whim of Volrath is the only expensive card amongst the entire bunch. In fact, just 10 cards in the deck make up over half of the deck's total price. In other words, it's very, very possible to make a super cheap Orvar deck that still packs a huge punch. When the commander is doing this much work, the rest of the deck doesn't need to be all that expensive to help him flex his might. So if you're not packing the deck with pricey cards like Spellseeker, Sakashima, Rhystic Study, Swan Song, Sapphire Medallion, Nykthos, and Fierce Guardianship, I would instead suggest these other alternatives. First, Mizium Skin joins the dive down that's already in the list, to both help us double our stuff and provide protection when needed. Then, Vidalcan Aethermage is another wizard cycling card that helps us locate our MVP creatures, which is just great to see. Speaking of creatures, Seagate Oracle isn't half bad because it helps us dig very fast. All of our one-mana spells turn into cantrips when we use them on this fella, which prevents us from running out of steam. Cloak of Feathers and Stream of Unconsciousness are other cantrip targeters that we could use too. And you know what? I'll also tip my hat to Powerstone Shard, a mana rock that feels great to have multiple copies of. It only produces colorless mana, which is an actual issue for this deck to be sure, but it's also still just completely hilarious. I don't think it's the worst idea to have an additional Swiftfoot Boots in here either, so that Orvar has even more protection and haste enablers when his infinite mana has given him infinite creatures that all need new shoes. And finally, if you're all in on the buyback combos, you could even try out Memory Crystal, which automatically reduces buyback costs to super duper cheap. This card's a fraction of the cost of a Sapphire Medallion, but it helps Orvar set up a lot of the same game-winning plays. And that's it from me. I know it was just a few swaps, but this is exactly where I'd want the deck to be. You can find the list in the description below with the very small number of cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this time with Orvar, and if you have any other recommendations for cards that you think your fellow Orvar players ought to play in their decks too, make sure you leave those suggestions in the comments below, where Orvar will probably make a bunch of copies of them later. Thanks so much for watching.